Hello, hello, beautiful listener. My name is AP Mobley, and I'm your host here at the Myths and Folktales and Fairy Tales podcast. I'm also the author of dark fantasy inspired by mythology, so if you ever wanted to check out my books, I'd really appreciate it. Before I get started, I just wanted to apologize for taking so long to make this episode. I said that during the Stories That Shaped Me section of the podcast, I'd be uploading one episode per week until the whole section was complete, but I missed 2 weeks. Honestly, I just needed a little bit of time to take a break and do absolutely nothing. Ever since my debut novel came out in 2018, I've used most of my free time to work nonstop on my books. I literally haven't taken any breaks from book related stuff in 6 years. I'm constantly reading and researching, brainstorming, plotting, drafting, studying the market and how to better reach my readers, drawing character art, writing newsletters, and most recently, making blog posts and podcast episodes. So, again, I apologize, but I realized I was burnt out and I just needed a short break. Okay, on to the episode. Today I'm talking about the Greek myth of Perseus and Andromeda. The reason I wanted to put it in the Stories That Shaped Me section of the podcast is because of the effect that the iconic film Clash of the Titans 1981 had on me. In case you didn't know, Clash of the Titans is a retelling of the Perseus and Andromeda story. I remember watching the movie with my dad a few times as a little kid. We watched all sorts of stuff together. But we didn't own the movie, so I couldn't just pop it into the DVD player whenever. I also wasn't as interested in live action films as I was in animated films when I was small, as I'm sure you could have guessed by all the animated films I've talked about up until this point. So I wasn't hunting it down or anything, even though it definitely held a special place in my heart because I watched it with my dad. Fast forward to when I was a teenager, I think 17. I had just finished writing a couple of creepy short stories as writing practice, just to see if I could tell a story from beginning to end in the first place. And once I finished them and was happy with them, I decided that I for sure wanted to be an author. I had lots of book ideas in that little head of mine, but there was one idea that I'd already been thinking about for a few years, and it wouldn't let me go. At this time, dystopian books, stuff like The Hunger Games, Divergent, Maze Runner, all that good stuff. They were everywhere. They were like the big thing. And I'd already been a fan of mythology for basically my whole life, especially Greek mythology, as I explained in the Heracles episode. So, the idea was to sort of mash those two things together, because it sounded amazing to me. It was exactly the sort of thing I wanted to read at that age. That is, a dystopian story with fantasy elements and Greek mythology incorporated into the plot. So I began drafting the story. Although I didn't finish it until I was 20 or 21, I can't remember exactly. And that story ended up being book one in my War on the Gods series, The Helm of Darkness. Now, the reason I just told you all of that, the reason I'm including it in this episode at all, is because while I was rereading the Greek myths to decide what I wanted to include in Helm, my memory was jogged. I remembered that cheesy old movie I watched with my dad, and I went looking for it. I ended up buying it on DVD, rewatching it, and of course, me being me, and finally being mature enough to really focus on a live action movie, I loved it. Not as much as I loved Disney's Hercules, obviously, but still, I loved it. I actually ended up watching it like 10 more times while writing The Helm of Darkness. Around that same time, I also watched the 1963 Jason and the Argonauts movie, which I did not see with my dad as a kid, sadly. Even still, that one is really good, especially the Hydra and the skeletons. If you know, you know. However, it's not as good as Clash of the Titans, in my opinion. But if you love Greek mythology and you haven't seen those movies, you need to do so ASAP. They're cheesy, but they are so much fun, and they definitely inspired me while I was writing my first book. All right, I'll stop rambling now. It's high time I get into the story of Perseus and Andromeda. Our tale begins with a princess of Argos, Danae. Now, Danae's dad, King Acrisius, receives news of a prophecy that says her son will one day kill him. So, Acrisius does the logical thing. You know, what we'd all do in this situation. And rather than being kind to his family to ensure that they'd never want to kill him, he locks his daughter Danae in what is basically an underground prison. But that doesn't stop her from getting pregnant. No. Zeus, the king of the gods, transforms himself into a sort of golden rain, seeps into Danae's prison, and impregnates her with our man of the hour, Perseus. After Perseus is born, Acrisius locks Danae and Perseus in a chest and tosses them into the sea, where they float all the way to Seriphos. A fisherman and his wife take in Danae as their daughter, and Perseus as their grandson, and for 15 years they all live peacefully together. So, of course, with Perseus being a son of Zeus and all, he grows up to be super strong and super tall and super handsome, and some people call him the son of Zeus even though they don't know for sure that he is. And the king of Seriphos, Polydectes, who is also the brother of the fisherman who took Danae and Perseus in, takes an interest in Danae and wants to marry her, but she refuses to marry him, so he makes her a slave. While his mother is being enslaved, Perseus is away, and during this time, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, comes to him in a dream and basically tells him that he's going to slay the Gorgon Medusa for her so that she can put Medusa's head on her shield. Perseus is like, yeah, sounds good to me, but Athena says he's not ready yet. He wakes up from the dream and he's like, wow, that was weird, and goes about his business. Pretty soon, he goes home to Seriphos, and when he gets there, he finds out that his mom has been enslaved by the king. Obviously, he's not happy about this, and he storms into the palace and finds her. When he sees how poorly she's being treated, he threatens to kill the king. But his mom is like, no, you can't do that. So Perseus and the fisherman take her to Athena's temple so she can work there and be left alone by the king. The king pretends to move past all this, but of course, he hasn't really, because he still wants Perseus's mom. But he knows that so long as Perseus is around, that's not going to happen. So he comes up with a plan to embarrass Perseus and try running him off. Basically, he throws this party for all the men to attend, and since he's the king, it's expected that all the guests bring him a gift. Perseus is poor, though, and he can't bring a gift. So when he shows up to the party, all the men start teasing him about not bringing anything. Well, he remembers Athena visiting him in that dream, and how she said he'd slay the Gorgon Medusa. And he says, hey, I'll bring the king a gift, the head of Medusa. Everyone laughs at this. And he's like, no, really, I'm gonna do it. So he leaves the party, and he goes out and prays that Athena will please talk to him about this. Eventually, Athena does show up, along with Hermes, the messenger of the gods. They tell Perseus that the journey to Medusa's lair is long, and it will be really difficult, so he needs to make sure that he's ready. He insists that he's ready to do it, but that he just doesn't know how to do it, on account of the fact that anyone who looks into Medusa's eyes is turned to stone. Athena says yes, he's going to have to avoid Medusa's gaze, and she gives him a polished shield so that he'll be able to see Medusa's reflection in the shield and slay the Gorgon without making eye contact with her. In some versions of the story, she also gives him Hades' Helm of Darkness, which cloaks the wearer with invisibility. For the long journey, Hermes lends Perseus his pair of winged sandals, which gives the wearer the ability to fly. And he also gives Perseus a sword to cut off Medusa's head with. Then the gods tell him where to go, and they send him off on his grand quest. First things first, he's got to go to the Grey Sisters to get Medusa's location. In some versions of the story, they give him Medusa's exact location, and in others, they just give him a clue. But anyway, the Grey Sisters are these beings who share one eye and one tooth among themselves. They're also aligned with Medusa, so Perseus has to steal their one eye before they're willing to tell him anything. Once he has the eye, they either tell him where Medusa is, or they tell him to go to the nymphs of Hesperides for his next clue. Again, it just depends on which version of the story you're reading. After that, he sets off. I should probably mention this too. In the versions of the story where Perseus has to go to the nymphs of Hesperides to get Medusa's location, they're usually the ones who go to the underworld and retrieve Hades' Helm of Darkness for him, rather than Athena just giving it to him earlier. No matter the version you're reading, Perseus eventually reaches Medusa's lair, and because of all those fancy items the gods lent him, he slays her no problem and wraps up her head so he doesn't accidentally look at it and turn to stone. In some versions of the story, this is also when Pegasus and Chrysaor are born. They come out of Medusa's bloody stump of a neck. In other versions of the story, they were already born before Perseus slays Medusa. Sadly, I'm not going to talk much more about Medusa today. I actually want to dedicate an entire episode to the different versions of her story later on. Other than, Hel from Norse mythology and a few other goddesses, Medusa is my favorite mythological figure. I actually have some projects in the future that are inspired by her, so I'd really like to make sure that I do her justice and give her her very own episode. Okay, anyway, at this point in the story, Perseus has basically finished his grand quest. He's just got to make it home and then offer up Medusa's head to the gods, since they're the ones who made it possible for him to retrieve. And while he's on his way back, he finally stumbles upon none other than Andromeda. And the way he finds her is definitely not how two people usually meet and fall in love. You see, she's stripped naked and chained to a rock by the sea because her mother, Cassiopeia, foolishly claimed that her daughter was more beautiful than even the sea nymphs. This angered the nymphs, and they complained to Poseidon, god of the sea. And Poseidon sent a sea monster to terrorize the kingdom. And the king was told that the only way to appease Poseidon would be to sacrifice Andromeda to the sea monster. When Perseus sees Andromeda, he's immediately smitten with her. He goes to her and asks her why she's chained up, and she explains her predicament. Perseus tells her that he'll slay the sea monster and save her, but that he'd like to marry her afterward. She agrees, and when the sea monster arrives, Perseus uses Medusa's head to turn it to stone. Perseus flies Andromeda back to her kingdom, and everyone is super happy because the sea monster is taken care of and Andromeda didn't have to die for that to happen. However, Andromeda's uncle is angry because he was supposed to marry Andromeda before, and he thinks it's unfair that Perseus gets to now, even though, he did nothing to help her and she'd be dead now if Perseus hadn't shown up. To shut up the uncle, Perseus turns him and his cronies to stone using Medusa's head, and then Perseus and Andromeda are married. Yay! They stay in Andromeda's kingdom for a year, and during that year, Athena comes to Perseus in a dream and takes back the sword, sandals, and helm that the gods let him use to slay Medusa. Once the year is up, Perseus and Andromeda take a ship so that Perseus can sail back to Seriphos, and when he gets back, he takes care of the king by turning the guy to stone, since he's still harassing Perseus's mom and is just overall a jerk. Perseus also makes the king's brother, the fisherman, the new king of Seriphos, and he gives Athena Medusa's head, which she puts on her shield. Still, Perseus and Andromeda's journey isn't over. There's the matter of wrapping up the prophecy about Perseus killing his grandfather, Acrisius. Now, Perseus doesn't set out to do this. He goes to Argos in secret, and one day, while he's playing a game in a competition, he accidentally hits Acrisius with a quoit and kills the old man that way. Oops. In the end, Perseus and Andromeda rule over Argos for the rest of their days. They live to be quite old, and they have lots of kids. And when they die, the gods put them in the stars as constellations. Before I go, I thought I'd let you know that if you're interested in reading my newsletter exclusive novella, Wrath of Persephone, the link to download the ebook is in this episode's description. If you want more myths, folktales, and fairy tales, I've also included the link to my myths, folktales, and fairy tales blog in the description. Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for the 7th story that shaped me, the lore surrounding fairies. I'll see you next time!